May 14, 1943. Bay of Biscay, 200 miles west of Cape Finisterre. A Consolidated B-24 Liberator drops through scattered clouds at 300 feet above grey Atlantic swells. Lieutenant James Hunto pushes his throttles forward, the bomber's 4 Pratt and Whitney engines screaming as the aircraft accelerates toward maximum speed. His bombardier arms 6 Mark 17 depth charges while the radio operator calls out altitude readings every 5 seconds. Through the plexiglas nose, Hunto watches a grey conning tower slice through whitecaps 3 miles ahead. The German submarine is fully surfaced, its crew scrambling toward the main hatch as lookouts spot the approaching aircraft. Standard doctrine: dive from altitude, drop charges, climb away. Hunto has practiced this maneuver 37 times during training, but as his altimeter winds down past 200 feet, something feels fundamentally wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics don't work. By the time his charges hit the water, that submarine will be at 60 feet depth, safely beyond the lethal radius of any aerial weapon in his bomb bay. He's going to miss, just like the 43 other attacks his squadron logged last month. Just like the hundreds of failed engagements that have allowed German U-boats to slip through the Bay of Biscay, while American aircrews follow procedures that guarantee failure. Hunto pulls up at 150 feet and banks away from the target. His depth charges remain locked in their racks. The German submarine completes its dive and disappears beneath Atlantic swells. The mission is officially recorded as contact made, attack aborted due to tactical considerations. But walking across the tarmac at Dunkeswell Air Station 4 hours later, Hunto knows he's violated direct orders by refusing to drop his weapons. The question that haunts him through the rest of that afternoon is simple. What if the entire anti-submarine campaign has been built on assumptions that make success mathematically impossible? The briefing room at RAF Dunkeswell smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, the distinctive combination that marked every Allied air station in southwest England during the spring of 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Roberts stood before 32 American pilots of the 480th Anti-Submarine Group, watching their faces register various degrees of skepticism as he explained the new tactical directive. Behind him, a blackboard displayed altitude specifications that contradicted every piece of training these men had received since joining the Army Air Forces. Gentlemen, effective immediately, all depth charge attacks will be conducted at 50 feet above sea level. Roberts tapped the chalk notation with enough force to leave white dust on his knuckles. Not 300 feet, not 200. 50 feet, measured by absolute altimeter, maintained from final approach through weapon release. The silence that followed carried the weight of professional doubt. These were experienced combat pilots who understood that flying a 4-engine bomber at 50 feet above ocean swells left approximately zero margin for error. A single engine failure at that altitude meant immediate water impact. Wind shear, turbulence, or pilot fatigue could transform a routine attack run into a funeral. Captain Bill Sanford, a veteran of 18 submarine contacts, raised his hand slowly. "Colonel, sir, 50 feet puts us within small arms range of enemy deck guns. We'll be taking fire from their 20mm cannons during the entire attack run. Every anti-submarine warfare manual specifies minimum altitude of 200 feet, specifically to avoid this engagement envelope." Roberts nodded, acknowledging the concern without dismissing it. "Captain, you're absolutely correct. Flying at 50 feet makes us vulnerable to defensive fire. It also makes our depth charges lethal instead of decorative." He pulled down a technical diagram showing concentric circles representing explosive effectiveness at various depths. The mathematics are straightforward. Mark 17 depth charges set for 25-foot detonation create a lethal radius of approximately 40 feet. When we drop from 300 feet altitude, those charges hit the water with enough forward momentum that they travel another 60 to 80 feet horizontally before exploding. By that time, Any submarine that dived when our aircraft first appeared is already below 100 feet depth, well outside our kill zone. Lieutenant Tom Hayes studied the diagram with the intensity of someone calculating odds for his own survival. So we've been missing because we're dropping too early, from too high, giving them too much warning. It's not training deficiency, it's physics. Roberts replaced the technical diagram with operational statistics that painted an uncomfortable picture of Allied anti-submarine effectiveness. March 1943, 43 attacks in this theatre, 2 confirmed kills. Success rate 4.6%. April, 37 attacks, 1 confirmed kill. Success rate 2.7%. The numbers got worse the more Roberts displayed them. Flying hours per successful submarine destruction, ammunition expenditure per confirmed target, aircraft losses compared to enemy casualties. Every metric revealed an anti-submarine campaign that was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate while achieving results barely distinguishable from random chance. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts clicked through the next slide, showing a map of the Bay of Biscay with concentration zones marked in red. The problem isn't our aircraft, our weapons, or our crews. The problem is that we've been fighting this war at altitudes that make success impossible. The Germans figured this out in 1942. That's why their U-boat commanders laugh at our attacks. They know that by the time we reach weapon release, altitude, they've got 45 seconds to reach safety, and 45 seconds is more than enough for a Type 7C to hit diving depth. The room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to something darker, a collective realization that months of dangerous missions might have been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. These pilots had lost friends to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and German fighters. They'd spent countless hours over empty ocean searching for targets that disappeared with predictable regularity. And now they were being told that institutional doctrine had made victory mathematically unlikely regardless of skill or courage. "But sir," Lieutenant James Alexander spoke up from the back row, "flying at 50 feet means we lose our reaction time. If we spot a submarine and it dives, we've got maybe 15 seconds to set up our attack run. That's not enough time to verify target identification, arm weapons, and execute proper approach procedures." Roberts had anticipated this objection. "Lieutenant, you're thinking about attacks the old way. Spot the submarine, begin approach, drop charges after the target submerges. The new doctrine eliminates the dive entirely. We catch them surfaced, or we don't attack at all." The implications took several seconds to register. Pilots exchanged glances that communicated professional concern mixed with tactical understanding. The old doctrine had been reactive, responding to submarine presence by attempting to catch them underwater. The new approach was predatory, striking targets in their most vulnerable configuration. Major Frank Carlton, the squadron's most experienced formation leader, worked through the logistics allowed. "So we're patrolling at 50 feet constantly, not just during attack runs. That means we're exposed to surface threats for the entire mission duration. If we encounter German aircraft or naval vessels, we have no altitude advantage for evasive maneuvers, and fuel consumption increases substantially at low altitude because we're fighting denser air resistance." Roberts pulled out another chart, this one showing comparative fuel burn rates at different altitudes. "Your concerns are valid, Major. Low-altitude patrol does increase fuel consumption by approximately 8% compared to standard cruise altitudes, but the tactical advantages outweigh the costs. At 50 feet, we can detect surfaced submarines at ranges up to 12 miles using the new Mark III radar. The Germans can't pick us up on their METOX detectors because we're below their search cone. We achieve complete tactical surprise." He tapped the fuel consumption chart. "And here's what makes the entire operation feasible. We're only patrolling assigned grid squares, not conducting long-range searches across the entire bay. The new absolute altimeter gives us precision altitude control that makes sustained low-level flight safe enough for operational use. Combined with improved weather forecasting and radar navigation, we can maintain 50 feet in conditions that would have grounded previous generations of patrol aircraft. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, one of 3 female navigation specialists assigned to the group, studied the grid pattern displayed on the briefing room map. "Sir, the grid system assumes intelligence can predict U-boat transit routes with enough accuracy to position aircraft in probable contact zones. What's our confidence level on that intelligence?" Roberts smiled slightly, recognizing the question as the kind of analytical thinking that separated competent officers from exceptional ones. "Miss Mitchell, our confidence level is approximately 85%, based on ultra-decrypts and traffic analysis of German naval communications. We know when submarines depart their bases, we know their approximate fuel range, and we know the convoy routes they're targeting. What we haven't been able to do is catch them during the transit phase, when they're most vulnerable. That changes today." He pulled down a final chart showing projected success rates based on operational research conducted at the 1st Sea Search Attack Group. "If we execute this doctrine properly, mathematical models suggest we should achieve success rates between 25 and 40%. That's 10 times our current effectiveness. It means every submarine that attempts transit through the Bay of Biscay faces a 1 in 3 chance of destruction. Over 90 days of sustained operations, that translates to approximately 40 confirmed kills. The number hung in the cigarette-hazed air like a promise and a threat. 40 submarines represented nearly 20% of Germany's entire operational fleet. It was a strategic impact that would fundamentally alter the Battle of the Atlantic, shifting the war from a defensive holding action to an offensive campaign that could win through mathematics rather than heroism. Captain Sanford raised his hand again. "When does this new doctrine take effect, sir?" Roberts checked his watch with the deliberate gesture of a commander about to commit his forces to combat. "First patrols launch at 0600 tomorrow. Weather forecasts show favourable conditions, good visibility, moderate seas. The Kriegsmarine is rotating 3 U-boat groups through the bay this week, approximately 12 submarines total. By this time next week, gentlemen, we'll know whether operational research can beat conventional wisdom." The April morning air carried the salt smell of ocean mixed with aviation fuel as ground crews prepared B-24 Liberators for the new low-altitude mission profile. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski watched Lieutenant Hunto's aircraft taxi toward the runway, noting how the bomber rode lower in the air than previous configurations. The new absolute altimeter installation required removing 60 pounds of equipment from the nose section to maintain proper weight distribution. Combined with reduced fuel loads for the shorter-range patrol missions, the aircraft handled differently than the long-range convoy escort profile Kowalski had been maintaining for 8 months. "Chief," one of his mechanics called from beneath the number 3 engine. "The manifold pressure gauge is reading 0.2 psi high. Should we scrub this bird for recalibration?" Kowalski walked over and checked the reading himself. 0.2. PSI variance was within tolerance for normal operations, but low-altitude flight demanded tighter specifications. The difference between 50 feet and 40 feet above ocean swells could mean the difference between mission success and water impact. "Scrub it," he decided. "Get the backup aircraft armed and fueled. Lieutenant Hunto's crew can transfer to Liberator 297. I'm not sending anyone out there with questionable instruments. Not at 50 feet. The decision cost 45 minutes while Hunto's crew moved their equipment and performed pre-flight checks on the replacement aircraft. But by 0730, 6 B-24 Liberators were airborne over the Bay of Biscay, maintaining precise 50-foot altitudes as they took up patrol positions in a grid pattern that stretched from Cape Finisterre to the French coast. Each aircraft carried 6 Mark 17 depth charges configured with 25-foot fuse settings. Each crew had been briefed on the new attack profile. Approach speed 170 miles per hour. Weapon release at 50 feet altitude. No attacks on submerged targets. The first contact came at 0943 hours. Lieutenant Frank Campbell's radar operator detected a surface target at 11 miles range bearing 270 degrees. Campbell turned toward the contact and dropped to 45 feet, his co-pilot reading altitude numbers while the bombardier armed depth charges. Through the morning haze, a grey conning tower became visible at 4 miles. The submarine was fully surfaced, diesel engines running, crew visible on deck. Campbell's bomber closed the distance in 90 seconds. The German lookouts spotted the approaching aircraft at approximately 2 miles range and immediately sounded the diving alarm. But 2 miles at 170 miles per hour left less than 40 seconds before weapon release. The submarine's conning tower was just beginning to submerge when Campbell's bombardier released 6 depth charges in a perfect spread pattern. The charges hit the water with synchronous splashes, their blunt nose designs causing them to sink slowly while maintaining the horizontal momentum from their carrier aircraft's speed. 25 feet beneath Atlantic swells, 6 high-explosive warheads detonated simultaneously directly beneath U-boat 659's pressure hull. The submarine, caught mid-dive with hatches still open and ballast tanks partially flooded, had no time to reach protective depth. The explosions cracked her hull like an eggshell, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding all compartments within seconds. Campbell circled the debris field for 20 minutes, photographing oil slicks and wreckage that confirmed the 480th Group's first successful attack using the new low-altitude doctrine. His radio transmission back to Dunkswell was brief, but carried significance far beyond simple tactical reporting. Contact confirmed, target destroyed, crew observed no survivors. New procedures effective. The second kill came 3 hours later, when Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's navigation calculations positioned Lieutenant Tom Hayes's aircraft exactly where Ultra Intelligence predicted U-boat 483 would surface for battery charging. Hayes caught the submarine completely unprepared, its crew still opening deck hatches when 6 depth charges exploded beneath their keel. The third success occurred just before sunset, when Captain Sanford found U-boat 717 running on the surface at maximum speed, attempting to reach French coastal waters before darkness fell. By the time Sanford's after-action report reached operational headquarters at 2200 hours, the mathematical implications were becoming clear. 3 attacks, 3 confirmed kills, 0 losses to Allied aircraft. Success rate 100%. The numbers were too small to be statistically significant, but they represented a fundamental shift in tactical effectiveness that operational planners could not ignore. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts stood in the communications center, reading contact reports and calculating revised projections for the 90-day campaign. If first-day results held consistent, if weather remained favorable, if aircraft maintenance kept pace with operational tempo, if German tactics didn't adapt faster than Allied innovation could counter-adapt, then 40 confirmed submarine kills over 3 months was no longer optimistic projection but conservative estimate. The telephone call from Coastal Command Headquarters came at 23:30 hours. Air Vice Marshal John Slessor, commander of RAF Coastal Command, wanted detailed briefings on American low-altitude tactics and immediate coordination with British squadrons operating in adjacent patrol zones. The new doctrine was expanding from experimental test to theatre-wide standard operating procedure. Roberts hung up the phone and turned to his operations officer. "Get every available crew into the briefing room at 0500. We're doubling patrol coverage starting tomorrow. If this works the way today's numbers suggest, we're about to fundamentally change how this war is fought." But standing alone in the communications center after his staff had departed, Roberts allowed himself a moment of professional doubt. 3 successes in 1 day was remarkable. Sustaining that success rate over weeks and months, while German submarine commanders adapted their tactics, would be exponentially more difficult. The Kriegsmarine hadn't dominated Atlantic warfare for 3 years by following predictable patterns. They would study these attacks, identify vulnerabilities in the new Allied approach, and develop counter-tactics that transformed American advantages into exploitable weaknesses. The question wasn't whether the low-altitude doctrine would work. Today had proven the concept beyond any reasonable doubt. The question was how long it would remain effective before German innovation forced another round of tactical evolution. In naval warfare, Roberts understood, Victory belonged not to the side with the best weapons or bravest crews, but to the organization that adapted faster than its opponent could counter-adapt. Tomorrow would bring more patrols, more contacts, more attacks, and somewhere in occupied France, German submarine commanders would be receiving reports of 3 boats that had simply vanished while crossing the Bay of Biscay. The education of the Kriegsmarine was about to begin, taught by American bombers flying too low and arriving too suddenly. Conventional doctrine to counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics had changed. Now the killing would begin in earnest. By the 3rd week of May 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz faced a mathematics problem that had no pleasant solution. His war diary for May 22nd recorded losses that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. 11 U-boats sunk in the Bay of Biscay during the previous 14 days. Another 7 damaged severely enough to abort their missions before reaching operational areas. The new Allied low-altitude tactics had transformed his submarine fleet's transit corridor from a manageable risk into what crews were already calling the Valley of Death. Dönitz stood in his operations bunker at Lorient, studying reconnaissance photographs that showed the extent of Allied air coverage. The images revealed patrol patterns of extraordinary density. B-24 Liberators, RAF Wellingtons, Sunderland flying boats, all maintaining altitudes that made them invisible to his METOX radar detectors until they were already positioning for attack runs. The centimetric radar these aircraft carried could detect surfaced submarines at ranges exceeding 12 miles, while German crews had perhaps 30 seconds warning before depth charges detonated beneath their keels. The traditional counter to air power was submission. Dive immediately upon aircraft contact, ride out the attack underwater, surface again when the threat passed. It had worked for 2 years, but the new Allied tactics eliminated the dive option entirely. By the time a U-boat commander recognized the threat, Allied aircraft were already releasing weapons that would reach their targets before his boat could achieve protective depth. The mathematics of dive times versus aircraft closing speeds no longer favored German survival, which left Dönitz with an option that contradicted every principle of submarine warfare. Instead of diving from aircraft contact, his boats would remain surfaced and fight. He issued Order 483 on May 23rd. The directive required all U-boats transiting the Bay of Biscay to stay on the surface when contacted by aircraft and engage with anti-aircraft weapons. Submarines would cross in groups of 3 or more to provide mutual fire support. The concentrated firepower of multiple boats might destroy enough Allied aircraft to make the low-altitude attacks too costly to continue. The order was a calculated gamble based on comparative economics. A Type 7C U-boat cost approximately £200,000 to build and carried a crew of 50 trained submariners. A B-24 Liberator cost roughly £60,000 and carried 10 aircrew. If German submarines could achieve a 2-to-1 kill ratio, aircraft destroyed versus boats sunk, the mathematics would favour the Kriegsmarine. Allied production capacity was formidable, but even America couldn't replace crews faster than Germany could train submariners if the attrition ratios tilted the right direction. But Dönitz understood the deeper implication of Order 483. He was transforming submarines from stealth hunters into surface combatants, forcing them to fight a war they were never designed to win. Anti-aircraft guns mounted on submarines faced fundamental disadvantages. The unstable platform of a rolling hull, the exposed crew vulnerable to strafing fire, the inability to maneuver while maintaining effective gunnery solutions. Every engagement would be a desperate gamble where German crews bet their lives against Allied willingness to press attacks despite defensive fire. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Mackenzie, operations officer for the 480th Anti-Submarine Group, read the intelligence summary describing German tactical changes with professional interest mixed with concern. Ultra-decrypts had provided copies of Order 483 within hours of its transmission to U-boat commands. The German decision to fight on the surface was strategically desperate but tactically dangerous. American pilots accustomed to attacking defenseless targets would now face concentrated anti-aircraft fire from boats designed specifically to maximize their defensive capabilities. The first test of the new German doctrine came on May 24th, when Flying Officer Howard Debnam's Sunderland flying boat encountered U-441, approximately 200 miles west of Brest. The German submarine had been modified extensively for anti-aircraft operations. Twin quadruple 20mm flak-veiling cannons mounted on raised platforms fore and aft of the conning tower. A 37mm semi-automatic gun positioned for maximum elevation coverage. Additional MG-42 machine guns positioned to provide close-range defensive fire. The submarine carried 14 men on deck instead of the usual 4, all trained specifically for anti-aircraft operations. Debnam spotted the submarine at 8 miles range and immediately began his attack run, approaching from 50 feet altitude at maximum speed. His crew armed depth charges while the nose gunner prepared to suppress German defensive fire. But as the Sunderland closed to 2 miles range, U-441's anti-aircraft weapons opened fire with a volume that shocked everyone aboard the Allied aircraft. Tracer rounds filled the air in a curtain of defensive fire that seemed impossible for a submarine to generate. The Sunderland shuddered under multiple hits as 20mm shells tore through its hull. Debnam maintained his attack course despite hydraulic failures, engine damage, and wounds that would prove fatal within minutes. His bombardier released 5 depth charges in a spread pattern that straddled the German submarine. The weapons detonated with precision, damaging U-441 severely enough to force an immediate return to base. But Debnam's Sunderland plunged into Atlantic swells seconds after weapon release. All 11 crew members died in the crash. The exchange represented exactly the mathematics Dönitz had calculated. 1. Allied aircraft destroyed for 1 German submarine damaged and forced to abort its mission. If that ratio held, Order 483 would succeed in making Allied low-altitude attacks prohibitively expensive. But the engagement also revealed tactical vulnerabilities that Allied commanders recognized immediately. Submarines fighting on the surface became stationary targets that couldn't maneuver effectively while maintaining anti-aircraft fire. Their defensive weapons had limited range and required exposed crews who were vulnerable to strafing attacks. The counter-tactics emerged within days. Allied aircraft would no longer attack submarines individually. Instead, patrol coordinators would direct multiple aircraft to converge on surfaced targets. The first aircraft would strafe German gun crews from beyond effective anti-aircraft range, while subsequent planes positioned for depth charge runs. The coordinated attacks would overwhelm submarine defenses through concentration of force, turning German surface fighting doctrine into a tactical trap. Lieutenant William Pomeroy demonstrated the new approach on June 18th when his radar operator detected 3 U-boats running on the surface in formation approximately 150 miles north of Cape Finisterre. Instead of attacking immediately, Pomeroy transmitted contact coordinates and circled at maximum detection range while additional Allied aircraft converged on the position. Within 30 minutes, 2 RAF Halifaxes, a Sunderland flying boat, and another American B-24 had joined Pomeroy's aircraft. The 5 Allied planes executed coordinated attacks that gave German submarines no effective defensive options. Halifaxes strafed from altitude, while Sunderlands approached from different bearings simultaneously. Pomeroy's B-24 made the final depth charge run while German gun crews were occupied with other threats. U-514 broke apart under direct hits. U-852 sustained damage that forced immediate withdrawal to base. The third, Submarine, U-621, managed to dive after suffering casualties that killed 6 crew members and wounded 12 more. The engagement demonstrated that surface fighting doctrine favored the side with numerical advantage and coordination capability. German submarines fighting alone or in small groups couldn't generate enough defensive fire to prevent coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft. And every minute spent on the surface engaging Allied planes was a minute of vulnerability to additional threats that might arrive without warning. Donitz's most desperate counter-innovation emerged in the form of U-flak boats. These were Type 7C submarines, extensively modified to serve as dedicated anti-aircraft platforms. U-441, U-256, U-621, and U-953 received complete rebuilds that transformed them from attack submarines into floating anti-aircraft batteries. The modifications were extraordinary. Quadruple flak-veerling mounts front and rear, 37mm automatic cannons with enhanced elevation capability. Even experimental rocket-propelled cables designed to entangle attacking aircraft. The U-flak boat's torpedo capacity was reduced to just 5 weapons, all loaded in tubes for self-defense purposes only. Fuel capacity was limited to Bay of Biscay operations, eliminating their ability to conduct Atlantic patrols. They existed for one purpose only: to lure Allied aircraft into engagement range and destroy them with overwhelming firepower. The concept was tactically sound: create specialized hunter-killers that could dominate the air-sea interface, making Allied low-altitude attacks suicidal. U-441, redesignated U-flak-1, sortied from Brest on July 8 under command of Kapitän-Leutnant Götz von Hartmann. The submarine's mission was straightforward: patrol the Bay of Biscay on the surface, engage any Allied aircraft that approached, and provide protective cover for damaged submarines unable to dive. Intelligence suggested that Allied pilots had grown cautious after several aircraft were shot down by German submarines. Perhaps the appearance of a dedicated anti-aircraft boat would force them to abandon their low-altitude tactics entirely. The test came on July 12 at 1600 hours. 3 RAF Beaufighter fighters detected U-flak-1 running on the surface, approximately 120 miles west of Brest. The British pilots recognized the submarine's unusual configuration immediately: extended deck platforms, multiple anti-aircraft emplacements, the distinctive silhouette of a boat designed specifically for surface combat. They also recognized the tactical opportunity. Beaufighters carried 20mm cannons instead of depth charges. They were fighters, not anti-submarine patrol aircraft, and their armament was perfectly suited for strafing attacks against exposed personnel. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The Beaufighters made coordinated passes from different angles, their cannons raking U-flak-1's deck with precision fire. German anti-aircraft gunners managed to damage 1 British fighter, but the concentrated strafing fire was devastating. 10 U-boat crew members died instantly. 13 more sustained wounds, including every officer qualified for submerged operations except the boat's doctor, Marine Stabssergeant Paul Pfaffinger. Pfaffinger, who had never commanded a submarine before that moment, managed to take control of the damaged boat and execute an emergency dive. He brought U-flak-1 back to Brest submerged, navigating entirely by dead reckoning since most of his bridge crew was either dead or incapacitated. For this action, he would receive the German Cross in gold, but the engagement had demonstrated conclusively that U-flak boats couldn't survive against coordinated attacks by aircraft designed specifically for air-to-air combat. Dönitz reviewed the action report with growing recognition that his surface fighting doctrine had failed. Between May and July, German submarines fighting on the surface had shot down 32 Allied aircraft, but they'd lost 26 boats sunk and another 17 so severely damaged they required extensive repairs. The mathematics no longer favoured German survival. For every Allied aircraft destroyed, the Kriegsmarine was losing nearly 1 full submarine with trained crew. The attrition ratio was exactly backward from what Order 483 required. On August 2nd, Dönitz rescinded the surface fighting directive. German submarines would return to their traditional doctrine: dive on aircraft contact. Transit the Bay of Biscay submerged as much as possible. Accept that some boats would be caught on the surface and destroyed, but preserve the majority of the fleet by avoiding engagement rather than seeking it. The experiment with surface combat had cost 43 submarines over 3 months, casualties the Kriegsmarine could not afford. For Allied anti-submarine forces, the German tactical retreat represented vindication of low-altitude bombing doctrine. The May through July period had produced results that exceeded even optimistic projections. 43 confirmed U-boat kills in 90 days. Another 28 boats damaged severely enough to abort their missions. Success rates had climbed from 4.6% in March to 42% by August. The transformation from failed doctrine to decisive tactical advantage had required just 4 months. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts stood in the operations centre at Dunkeswell, reviewing final statistics for the Bay offensive. His pilots had flown 3,200 hours during the 3-month campaign. They'd lost 12 aircraft to enemy action, 6 more to operational accidents. 28 aircrew had died. But the 480th Group alone had accounted for 19 confirmed submarine kills and assisted in 7 more, where multiple aircraft shared credit for destruction. The broader Allied campaign had involved RAF Coastal Command squadrons, Navy patrol bomber units, and specialized anti-submarine groups from multiple nations. Together, they'd turned the Bay of Biscay from a relatively safe transit corridor into a killing zone where German submarines faced 1 in 3 odds of destruction during every passage attempt. The cumulative impact was strategic rather than merely tactical. Submarine availability for Atlantic operations had declined by 40%. Merchant ship losses to U-boats had dropped to their lowest levels since 1941, but Roberts understood that victory had come through mathematical certainty rather than dramatic heroism. The low-altitude doctrine worked because it eliminated variables that had made previous tactics unreliable. Flying at 50 feet removed the submarine's dive option. Attacking only surface targets maximized weapon effectiveness. Using absolute altimeters provided precision altitude control that made sustained low-level flight operationally feasible. The combination created conditions where Allied success became mathematically predictable rather than dependent on luck or exceptional skill. The human cost was documented in maintenance logs and casualty reports that told stories beyond simple statistics. Technical Sergeant Kowalski had watched 37 different crews depart on missions that produced 17 confirmed kills and 4 aircraft losses. The ratio suggested success, but each loss represented 10 men who'd followed orders, executed proper procedures, and died anyway because warfare produced casualties regardless of tactical advantage. The mathematics of victory were cold comfort for families receiving telegrams about sons, husbands, and fathers who wouldn't return. The strategic implications reached far beyond the Bay of Biscay. German submarine construction couldn't replace losses at the rate Allied aircraft were inflicting them. New U-boats required trained crews, and training programs couldn't produce qualified submariners faster than combat attrition eliminated them. The Kriegsmarine faced a death spiral, where each lost boat made subsequent boats more valuable and their loss more devastating to overall fleet capability. By September 1943, German submarine operations in the Atlantic had effectively ceased as a strategic threat to Allied convoy routes. The technological evolution continued beyond low-altitude bombing. Acoustic homing torpedoes that could track submarine engine noise, rocket-propelled depth charges that could be fired from beyond anti-aircraft range, improved radar that could detect periscopes and snorkels. Each innovation built upon the fundamental principle that Roberts had proven during the Bay offensive. Success came from eliminating the enemy's tactical options rather than from achieving superior execution of comparable tactics. But the deepest lesson was institutional rather than technical. The low-altitude doctrine had succeeded because it challenged assumptions that everyone believed but nobody had tested rigorously. High-altitude bombing was standard procedure, not because it worked, but because it was standard procedure. Training manuals codified approaches that had never been validated under operational conditions. And hundreds of good men had died following tactics that were guaranteed to fail, simply because institutional momentum prevented critical analysis of established practice. The recognition came slowly to officers who'd spent careers trusting that military doctrine existed because it had been proven effective. Roberts himself had initially doubted Lieutenant Commander Rofort's mathematical analysis, assuming that conventional wisdom reflected accumulated combat experience. Only the undeniable evidence of success rates climbing from 4% to 42% had forced acceptance that standard operating procedures could be fundamentally wrong about basic tactical principles. The war would continue for another 2 years. German submarines would introduce snorkels that allowed battery charging while submerged. They'd develop Type 21 boats, capable of sustained high-speed underwater operations. They'd adapt their tactics again and again, seeking advantages that would restore their strategic position in the Atlantic campaign. But they never recovered from the losses inflicted during the Bay of Biscay offensive. The mathematical certainty of low-altitude attacks had broken the back of the U-boat threat permanently. On August 27, 1943, Lieutenant James Hunto returned from his final patrol mission before rotation back to the United States. He'd completed 62 combat flights, participated in 17 submarine attacks, and achieved 4 confirmed kills. His aircraft showed battle damage from defensive fire, weather stress, and the cumulative wear of operating at extreme low altitudes over hostile waters. But the most significant change wasn't visible in maintenance logs or combat reports. Hunto had watched institutional doctrine transform from guaranteed failure to decisive advantage within 4 months. He'd seen mathematical analysis overcome decades of conventional wisdom. He'd experienced the difference between following procedures that made success unlikely and executing tactics designed to make victory mathematically predictable. The lessons went beyond submarine warfare into fundamental questions about how military organizations learn, adapt, and ultimately win or lose based on their willingness to challenge assumptions that everyone accepts but nobody has proven. Walking across the tarmac at Dunkeswell for the last time, Hunto reflected on the mission that had started everything. The German submarine he'd refused to attack on May 14th because the mathematics guaranteed failure. That decision had violated direct orders and could have ended his career. Instead, it had contributed to a tactical revolution that changed how the entire Battle of the Atlantic was fought. Sometimes the most courageous act was refusing to follow procedures that were designed to fail. The memorial service for Flying Officer Howard Debnam and his Sunderland crew was held at Pembroke Dock on June 3rd. Debnam had attacked U-Flak 1 following standard doctrine, pressing his attack despite devastating defensive fire, completing his mission even as his aircraft disintegrated around him. He'd done everything correctly according to training and tactical manuals, and he died because courage and proper execution couldn't overcome tactics that were fundamentally flawed. His death, and the deaths of 127 other Allied aircrew during the Bay Offensive, represented the real cost of institutional learning. The transition from failed doctrine to effective tactics required men willing to challenge conventional wisdom, despite career risks. It required commanders willing to authorize experimental approaches that might prove disastrously wrong. And it required sacrifice by crews who flew missions while tactics were still evolving and success rates were climbing toward effectiveness but hadn't arrived there yet. The statistical summary of the Bay of Biscay offensive would eventually fill classified reports that detailed every engagement, analyzed success factors, and recommended doctrine changes for future anti-submarine operations. But the numbers could never capture what Technical Sergeant Kowalski understood while watching aircraft depart on missions that might not return. Victory came from mathematics that made success predictable, but mathematics couldn't eliminate the human cost of achieving that victory. By November 1943, the Bay of Biscay had become so dangerous for German submarines that most commanders chose extended routes around Britain rather than risk transit through the killing zone. Allied air coverage had expanded to include the western approaches and Norwegian waters. New escort carriers provided air coverage for mid-ocean convoy routes that had previously been beyond land-based aircraft range. The U-boat threat that had nearly strangled Britain in 1942 had been reduced to a manageable nuisance that could no longer achieve strategic impact, regardless of tactical successes. The transformation had required 50 feet of altitude change, 3 months of operational testing, and 43 German submarines destroyed to prove that institutional wisdom could be wrong about basic tactical principles. But the lesson extended beyond anti-submarine warfare into every aspect of military operations. Doctrine existed to be challenged. Conventional approaches should be questioned rather than accepted. And sometimes the difference between victory and defeat came from asking whether standard procedures actually worked or simply felt comfortable because everyone followed them. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts received orders in December, transferring him to the Pacific Theatre, where B-24 operations against Japanese shipping would benefit from lessons learned over the Bay of Biscay. He departed Dunkeswell, knowing that the tactics he'd helped develop would continue influencing anti-submarine warfare for decades. The absolute altimeter would become standard equipment on patrol aircraft worldwide. Low-altitude attack profiles would be taught at every naval aviation training program, and future generations of officers would study the Bay Offensive as an example of how tactical innovation could achieve strategic results when mathematical analysis replaced conventional assumptions. But Roberts also understood that the human element couldn't be reduced to statistics or replicated through doctrine. The pilots who'd flown 50 feet above Atlantic, swells for hours at a time. The radar operators who'd maintained equipment that meant the difference between successful attacks and wasted missions. The ground crews who'd kept aircraft operational, despite maintenance challenges that would have grounded previous generations of patrol bombers. Their skill, courage, and professionalism had transformed mathematical theory into operational reality. The final accounting came in May 1945, when Germany surrendered and detailed analysis of German naval records became possible. Kriegsmarine documents confirmed what Allied intelligence had suspected. The Bay of Biscay offensive had destroyed 23% of Germany's operational submarine fleet during a 3-month period. Another 18% had sustained damage severe enough to require major repairs. The cumulative impact had been decisive in ending the U-boat threat as a strategic factor in the Atlantic campaign. More significantly, the offensive had demonstrated that technological innovation, combined with tactical creativity, could overcome numerical inferiority and achieve strategic results. The Allies hadn't won through superior numbers or better submarines. They'd won by flying lower than doctrine suggested was safe, attacking when mathematics guaranteed success, and refusing to accept conventional wisdom that made victory impossible. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes winning required breaking every rule except the ones that actually mattered. The story of the Bay of Biscay offensive would fade from public memory as larger battles and more dramatic victories captured historical attention. Most people would remember D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final drive into Germany. Few would recall the 3-month period when American bombers flew at 50 feet above Atlantic waters and sank 43 German submarines by refusing to follow doctrine that had failed for 2 years. But for the men who'd flown those missions, maintained those aircraft, and planned those operations, the lesson remained clear. Victory came from mathematics that made success inevitable, courage that made execution possible, and institutional flexibility that allowed innovation when conventional approaches failed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.